Hello and welcome to the India Hangout. The big question we're asking is the Scottish referendum to be or not to be with the UK. With me, James Crabtree, Mumbai Bureau Chief of the Financial Times, Yashwant Deshmukh of polling company Seawater, and of course Ayaz Memon. So Ayaz, what do you think? And what's your first question?
What's going to happen to the Scotch?
What's going to happen to the Scotch? Yes, so we're going to address that important question in a moment. But before that, let's understand what this is all about as quickly as possible. And who better for that than James Crabtree? James, go ahead.
During today, some 6 million Scots have headed to the voting booths. The question is, should Scotland be an independent nation? There have been rumblings of discontent from Scotland for years. The last Labour government in Britain attempted to head these off at the pass by creating a Scottish Parliament, effectively a devolved assembly, but that never quite managed to sort of quash the demand for full independence. And so in an attempt to head that off, Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron offered a referendum a couple of years ago and has come perilously close to losing it, although most of the polls now suggest that the No campaign, that is, those who are against independence, will narrowly win when the results are revealed at about 5 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Right. And James, very quickly, now this has been around for maybe 3 centuries. So how did it all escalate so suddenly and become an issue where a country is going to polls to actually, in some manner, secede?
I mean, that's a complicated question. There has been a long-running demand for independence in Scotland that maybe a third of the population has agreed with. I think it's bound up in the events of the last couple of years, the aftermath of the financial crisis, the sort of changing nature of Britain, in particular in the global era, where many of the things that held Britain together, its empire, its belief, its sort of Protestant identity, wars against the French, all sorts of the things that were part of Britain as a nation have gradually weakened, and there hasn't been a sort of countervailing force to create new bonds of national identity between the different nations of Britain and the United Kingdom, and into that space Scottish nationalism has pushed up.
Right, and that's very interesting. And one has been reading that, for instance, the current political leadership of Britain seems to represent the nadir of this whole relationship, particularly as viewed from Scotland. Yashwant, let me come to you. This is also a fascinating exercise as a pure polling, as a student of polls and the polling, the world of polling. You must be amazed that this is just asked one question: should Scotland be an independent country? Yes or no? What do you think?
That's right. It's actually very fascinating, and it's not. And let me remind you, this is not the only one referendum which has been seen in the recent past, in the recent history. In Canada, we have seen such referendum for the Quebec, which the last one was obviously voted a no. But then again, it is very closely contested for many years now, as far as the Quebec identity is concerned. And we know for sure that the question of identity, separate nationalist identity, it's very important in many other regions of the world, including even in India. The problem that we are facing in Kashmir is actually a question of Kashmiri identity and being different from India. So I'm watching it very keenly, and all the polls that are happening, and actually for last 1 year, since the tracking poll started, the No campaign was almost maintaining a lead of almost about 10%, but it just started shrinking down in the last 3 months or so, and especially when the YouGov poll for the first time reported that it probably has a 1% lead about 2 weeks back. That is where I think the world started taking notice. Till that point of time, everybody was keen on observing a Scottish referendum with an idea that, okay, the no vote is going to win some or whatever. But all of a sudden, after that poll coming in, the world started paying attention that no, this is something unique, something else can also happen. And it is possible. It's a very, very close race. The last polls which came out yesterday evening the ICM poll and one more poll actually gave a lead of only 2%, which is very much within the statistical margin of error of 3% for the polling. And the two things which are going to be very important while today, I mean, during the poll. One is the highest ever application for the postal ballots in Scotland. It has never happened before. With almost every fifth voter has asked for a postal ballot just to make sure that they vote. So that is very curious and very important to see how if that has any impact. And second is the young voting population, which is different from the other voting. In fact, James can correct me if I'm wrong, but probably the 16 and 17-year-old voters of Scotland are allowed to vote in this referendum, which generally was not taken earlier into the polling numbers, picking up only 18+. So there are some final adjustment and redesigning in the poll that was happening among many pollsters. So these two factors are actually, I would say, are very, very, very interesting to observe. I mean, and even though most of the political analysts are saying that the no vote might win eventually, but I'm looking for a very keen contest. Probably around 3 in the morning, we would start getting the trends, which would let us know if it is going to be a really photo finish or it's going to be a kind of easy no.
Right. Okay, Yashwant, yes.
So I have a question for James. I mean, you know, Scotland is going to vote yes or no.
Yeah.
What is the mood? What is the feeling in Britain? Are they worried that Great Britain might become not so great, or Little Britain, in case the Scottish people decide to say no?
James? Okay, James, I think we lost the connection, but we'll come back in a moment. Yashwant, you were saying that you noticed this other big sort of referendum vote in Canada, and this was about Quebec and so on. Is this, you know, the interesting thing here is that there are constitutional provisions I mean, there is an allowance for such referendum votes to take place. I mean, for instance, in India, it cannot take place. Am I right?
Are you asking to me?
Yeah. Yes, Yashwant.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, yes. Constitutionally speaking, it's a very delicate matter. We don't have any constitutional specification for referendum as such, but we do have the two referendums which took place officially or unofficially, as you may call, in 1947 after we got freedom. One was officially in Junagadh, and another which is termed as unofficial referendum that was held in Nagaland. So one went in favor of India, and another actually went against India. But even then, Pandit Nehru actually disapproved of that referendum in Nagaland. And one is the most recent one, which I am still have to. I have no clue what the constitutionality of it about. In Raigad in Maharashtra, you might remember that there was an SEZ being carved out, and the farmers were against it. And the district magistrate over there actually went for a referendum, which was almost 96% saying no for the SEZ, which was sent to the Maharashtra Assembly, and based on that referendum, the decision was called off. So I don't know what was the constitution provision under which that district magistrate took the decision of holding the referendum. But yes, as far as the Indian Constitution is concerned, I'm no constitution expert, but whatever I know, or I have talked to other experts, the term referendum is not really applicable, or not really is available within the gambit of within the ambit of Indian Constitution.
Right. So James, I think Ayaz had a question.
Yes,
he wanted to. Yeah.
I mean, Scotland will vote yes or no, but what is the mood? What is the feeling in Britain? I mean, are people saying that Great Britain might be not so great, or it might become Little Britain? Is there a worry, concern?
Well, I think so. In Scotland, the referendum has been passionately followed. I think that's the first thing to say. Often there's a sense in modern politics in the West that there's a great deal of political apathy around and about. But this campaign has been passionately followed and argued. It's seen very high levels of engagement. The turnout is expected to be high, and the result is expected to be close. In the rest of Britain, I mean, I think the mood is very nervous, verging on panicked amongst the political establishment, particularly because, as your previous contributor said, because of this poll that came out relatively recently suggesting that the Yes campaign might win, because the No campaign had held such a consistent lead ever since this began of around 10 points. This caught everyone completely by surprise and forced the political leaders of the three main British parties to hurry up to Edinburgh to begin to promise more devolution in order basically to persuade wavering voters that they should switch against the referendum rather than in favour. So I think there are grave worries about what a yes vote would do to the standing of Britain internationally, to its defence, and indeed how the union of the nations would even function were Scotland to be independent in terms of currencies and debt and public spending. So I think amongst the people there's a great deal of excitement, but amongst the political establishment this is causing a huge amount of anxiety.
And we are showing visuals of both the Yes and the No campaign, including visuals we showed you earlier from the campaigns. Going forward now, I mean, of course, we will have a decision in 24 hours. But how would things to go? I mean, how would things go on the key parameters? Economic, political. If it's a yes and if it's a no.
Well, if it's a no, what will happen is that some unspecified process of providing greater devolution to Scotland will begin. This is sometimes called Devo Max, the maximum amount of devolution. So devolution of more fiscal policy, more tax-raising powers, control over certain other issues. This, however, creates problems for the rest of the country, because if you do that for Scotland, you then suddenly have to do it for England and Wales and Northern Ireland. And so Britain's rather messy constitutional settlement becomes even messier, and that will lead to political rows and infighting. However, that's nothing compared to what will happen if you have a yes vote. So far, this campaign has been conducted with a relatively good temper, I would say, given how these things could be conducted. Not too much personal slanging matches, not too much petty nationalism. But the risk is that if there's a yes vote, that will all disintegrate, because a lot of things are very unclear. It's not at all clear which currency Scotland would use, for instance. Scotland says that it would like to keep the pound. Politicians in England or the rest of the United Kingdom say they're not going to be allowed to keep the pound, or at least under very strict conditions. So, on some very basic levels, if Scotland votes yes, there are going to be some extremely panicked negotiations starting on Friday, and I think you could expect to see a very sharp reaction in financial markets if there is a yes vote, with the pound and British 10-year bonds falling quite substantially, and equities as well. So I think that this would have a pretty immediate effect. Now, that isn't to say that Scotland couldn't function as an independent nation. I mean, I think there has been a bit of scaremongering during the campaign. I mean, it's unclear whether Scotland would benefit from being an independent nation. Most economists, I think, probably suggest that it wouldn't. Either it would be neutral or it would be slightly worse off. But I think the idea that suddenly Scotland is going to collapse if it becomes independent is pretty laughable. I'm sure they'll do fine. Nonetheless, the process could be rather awkward.
So, Yashwant, do you have any idea what the kind of skew is? Is it that the youngsters want to kind of be independent, or is it the old guard which says no, they might have memories of or longings of becoming independent? I know the original James Bond, Sean Connery, was a strong votary of not being part of the United Kingdom. Do you have any numbers, something available in terms of data?
Numbers which I was studying with all the polls that came in. In fact, the youth vote trend is following pretty much the rest of the Scottish vote trend. So there is not much of higher yes among the Scottish youth or higher no among the Scottish youth kind of trend, not really visible. It has gone up towards the yes side with the rest of the population, and it came down with the rest of the population on the no side as well. So it's pretty much the same, but it's gonna be the relative turnout factor. With what James has said, that it's both the camps are going to basically now depend on the turnout factor. Which camp manages a bigger turnout is going to have a couple of points compensated on that account. So that is going to be very important. But there is one more factor, that apart from the national identity, it's also a question of about economy. It has a lot to do about the oil in the northern seas up there, which the Scottish claim that they own the oil, and they don't really get back in the economy whatever the kind of the amount that they actually give to British economy. They don't really get back that in proportion. That's the big claim that many of the Scottish politicians make. So and it's not something which is Teflon to the rest of the world. When I was watching the first the referendum in the first election in Aceh in Indonesia, it was almost similar to that sentiment, that the entire oil and natural gas in Indonesia was actually in Aceh, and the Acehnese felt that Jakarta is not giving back anything to them. So that's where the idea of independence had started over there. So economy is a big issue, but at the same time, the youth is not all one-sided for the yes vote, for a simple reason that it certainly sees the opportunity in rest of the being part of the Great Britain and being part of the or being accessible to the European Union.
Right, that's very interesting points. And let me read out a few yeses and nos, from well-known people. Andy Murray says yes to Scottish independence. Deutsche Bank says Scotland leaving UK will bring severe austerity. David Beckham has joined the no team. David Cameron, of course, says that Scotland will face a painful divorce. Alex Salmon, the man behind this whole effort from the Scottish point of view, says it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the Scots. Alistair Darling on the other side says independent Scotland will face budget cuts. So there's an element of threat hanging over it, James. So if, let's say, this were to, the split were to happen, is it likely to be, not so amicable, and could things get a little frosty or even beyond that?
Also, Govind, how will it impact David Cameron's future?
Yeah, exactly. That's another good point. Yes, James?
Well, I think if it goes through, it's going to be incredibly difficult for it to remain amicable, simply because the negotiations will then be conducted between two independent nations who have differing interests, and there are a number of points of contention from which part of the country houses Britain's nuclear deterrent, the nuclear submarines that are currently parked just outside of Glasgow, which the Scots don't want, to how you split up the British Armed Forces. Scotland would need to have an independent army of some description. All sorts of different points in negotiation. It would be, I think, it would be extremely difficult to then conduct that as a sort of velvet divorce, although not impossible. I mean, you saw with, for instance, the Czechs and the Slovaks within recent memory, two countries that slightly different circumstances, but that managed to go their own ways relatively amicably. Now, for David Cameron, I think part of the reason why he has so prominently gone up to Scotland in the last couple of days is that he began to realize that if he loses this, he may be able to continue as Prime Minister, but it's going to be pretty difficult for him to do so. There will certainly be calls for his resignation, and I think given that most people still expect the referendum to be lost, meaning that Scotland will stay within the United Kingdom, if on Friday morning we wake up and discover that it's won, David Cameron has said that he won't resign, but he will come under enormous pressure to do so, not simply from members of the public, but from within his own party. The Conservative Party is self-described as the conservative and unionist party, meaning that belief in the union is absolutely central to what they believe in. So to be the Prime Minister, and he's not terribly popular at the best of times, to be the Prime Minister who presided over the destruction of the United Kingdom, I think it would be very difficult for him to carry on. Now, he might just about manage to do so, but it would be very, very awkward. So.
And James, what about some of the other things? Okay, so we've talked about economic, and this is, I guess, is the political. What about social? I mean, what could it do to people between the two the regions today and potentially nations tomorrow, if the vote were to go that way? I mean, how would they interact with each other? Could that change at all, or would things be as they were always?
I don't think it would change a huge amount. I mean, the two countries are relatively well integrated. I mean, I didn't mention this. I was born in Scotland. My sister and her family live in Glasgow. There are many families who would be, in a sense, divided by this, but one presumes that in the end you're not going to have to show a passport to go north or south of the border, and that sort of trade and travel between the two countries will go on pretty much as it was before. I think more interesting is the fact that two countries could develop quite different social models. I mean, part of this campaign has always been about the fact that Scotland, broadly speaking, is a more left-wing country than England. It has different traditions which tend to be more egalitarian, to have a belief in a stronger state. For instance, if you live in Scotland, you don't have to pay to go to university, and in theory you get free care when you grow old. In England, you do have to pay a great deal to go to university, and you don't get free care, because the English political parties tend to be more right-wing and tend to prefer lower taxes, whereas the Scots, where the Conservative Party, Mr. Cameron's party, have been reduced to almost nothing, tend to be more left of centre. So I think there certainly would be a long-term change in the structure of the two countries, and that would have profound political implications, particularly for the Labour Party, the Britain's second party, the centre-left party, which effectively relies on Scottish votes whenever it forms a government, and without the 50 or 60 odd Scottish MPs that many of which are Labour MPs, it would be extremely difficult for the Labour leader, Ed Miliband, to form a majority in England, except, of course, if the Labour Party then itself in England moved to the right. So I think, were there to be independence, it has seismic implications for both countries and their future political makeups.
James, one quick question, and then I'm going to come to Yashwant. There's a question that we've got here, which says, will Scotland's independence, if so, benefit the working class of Scotland? What's your understanding?
Well, Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, would, I think, say that it would, because under Scotland you would have a securer national health service, you would have more generous welfare, and you would not have policies, for instance, the current policies of austerity that have been, they would say, foisted upon Scotland by a government in London, in Westminster. The No campaign would say the opposite. They would say that an independent Scotland would live a more economically precarious existence, that the nationalists make unrealistic assumptions about how much money you get from oil revenues, and that independence itself would be quite costly in terms of Scottish businesses, banks, insurance companies, some big industrial groups deciding that basically they needed to move to London because it was too insecure living in Scotland, and that will have an effect on ordinary people's incomes, whether they be middle class or not. Actually, slightly in contrast to what was said before, my understanding is that there's quite a big difference also between young and old, where it tends to be the young are quite, from the data that I've seen, overwhelmingly in favor of independence, and it tends to be the elderly, particularly the over 65s, who are worried about their pensions, who are overwhelmingly for keeping the union. Now, that isn't to say that sort of Scotland will continue to get more nationalist over time. I think it's possibly that elderly voters are more risk averse, and so they're a bit more concerned about what might happen if there is an independence vote.
Right. Okay, Yashwant, if I can come back to you now, what's the lesson in all of this? I mean, having, as someone, at least from a polling perspective, seen some of these large referendum exercises in countries, is there a theme or a thread that you're seeing that we should be thinking about? I mean, not because it could lead to a referendum here too, but clearly because it suggests that people are getting restless or wanting more than perhaps they're getting.
Well, the contexts are different in most of the countries and most of the referendum as we are talking. Just as James mentioned, the velvet divorce of Slovakia and Czech Republic. But then these are the kind of artificial lines which were drawn after probably the First or the Second World War, and when they are in problems. Say, for example, I'm in Berlin. I mean, it's not just about the velvet divorce, it's also about the velvet marriage. This city has most symbolically brought down an artificial line in the recent history. So so the contexts are pretty different. But as far as Scotland is concerned, it goes beyond this this recent history of First World War or Second World War. It goes beyond that for hundreds and hundreds of years, and probably the demographics around the world which are facing these kind of situations, for example, Catalonia in Spain, or for example, the Kurdish people. I mean, they are going to be pretty excited with the idea of Scotland getting a yes vote. But plenty of the other movements which are going around the globe might be looking at this as a lesson of not to give much of a freedom to separated voices, else it actually leads to this situation. So it's gonna be different way different people are going to react. But as far as the India is concerned, I guess that the idea of referendum is not just for the sedition purpose, not just for the for counting if anyone wants to carve a new country out of India or anything like that. But let me remind you and other viewers that the idea of referendum is to ask people on various policy issues as well. And UK and US, they hold hundreds of referendum along with their normal elections. Many of the time, most of the advanced democracies hold. They don't really go for one vote and let the parliament or the president decide everything. The problem in India is that we have followed the one part of Westminster democracy that okay, we are going to have this form of democracy, but then it's an indirect democracy, and once the elections are done, we never go back to the people asking about the important decisions that the parliament or the parliament is taking. So that is an incomplete form of democracy. You know, you remember the 123 nuclear agreement, or so many things under the sun which the public needs to be educated about. And the reason why we don't have referendums is that our parliamentarians or our political parties say that Indians are not educated enough, they are illiterated, they are not informed enough to have a referendum. And my answer is, if they are educated or literate or informed enough to elect you as a member of parliament, then they are informed and educated and literate enough to voice the opinion on any other policy decision which they deem fit for their country to be governed on. Right. So this idea of referendum is not just idea of referendum for independence is just one of the many part of the entire referendum exercise. Right. So we need to learn a lot more, and we need to be more open to make our democracy more comprehensive by incorporating the idea of referendums. Right. So and that's a good point to take on board. Last question, James. You're of course in India now as Mumbai bureau chief of the Financial Times. How should India view this? I mean, not that you're the best person to answer this, but how do you see this? I mean, will it make any difference if the split happens, and or even if it happens, does life continue as normal from an India point of view?
Well, I think there's a general lesson to be taken out of the referendums in Scotland or Quebec or other places, which is that self-determination in an era of globalization is a very powerful force. You very rarely see mergers between nations, but over the last 2 decades, you've seen, maybe a dozen more new nations form, whether it was Slovakia that we were talking about before, or South Sudan, or in the Balkans. And I suppose the lesson for India is that if you want to keep a nation together, you have to be always alert to these threats of secession. And in the British case, it is clear that the bonds that used to hold our nation together had atrophied, and they have not been recreated in a modern setting. The bonds of empire and Protestantism and European war were not replaced by something new, whether that's around common institutions like the NHS, or, I don't know, the good feeling around the Olympics, whatever it might be, whatever you think would be the source of a new form of 21st century nationalism. And particularly in India, a country that has so many people, so many linguistic movements, and already has a number of secessionist movements within it, whether it's in the Northeast or Kashmir or where have you. this is an urgent political priority to listen and to try and create new bonds between your people, because if not, then the call for self-determination is a legitimate and very powerful one.
Right. Okay, James, we've run almost to the end of the show. Ayaz had a couple of unanswered questions. Huh?
No, I think the common question which both of us are asking is that the supply of the most famous product of Scotland will continue irrespective.
James, last word, a quick one on that.
Well, I don't know. My prediction is it's going to be a narrow vote for no. I'll be rather sad, I must say, as someone who grew up in Scotland, if I'm proved wrong. But I think the polls of the last few days have been pretty consistent. Right. So I think, I think it's just about safe.
Right, and Ayaz is concerned about the supply of Scotland's most famous product, Scotch.
I think India's love of whiskey is going to be safe, whatever happens. Imported Scotch will continue to flow over your borders, so I wouldn't worry too much.
Okay, that's a good note to end on. We wish it all goes well and the people get what they want, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the people now. The referendum means the will of the people or the choice of the people will prevail, and that's what we want.
Right, that's all we have time for in the India Hangout. Thank you, James. Thank you, Yashwant. And of course, I as my co-anchor. We'll be back with India Hangout tomorrow, same time. Thanks for watching.